Everyone thinks they know their neighbors until the moment comes when you realize someone is trying to steal everything your family ever built. That moment hit me like a storm rolling in across the water. One day, I was working in my workshop at the lake cabin, sanding a cedar board smooth just the way my grandfather had taught me. The next, I was staring into the eyes of an HOA president who looked at my family legacy like it was nothing more than a prize waiting for her son. The way she stood on my dock clipboard, clutched tight smile, stiff, and eyes sharp. I knew she had come for more than a friendly chat. What I did not know yet was just how far she was willing to go, or how much she was ready to destroy to hand my cabin over to her son. I grew up on that dock. The wood still carries the hammer marks my grandfather left when he built it with his own 2 hands. I was 12 the day he put a sanding block in my grip and told me to feel the grain. "The wood will show you which. Way to go, Clay," he whispered. And in that moment, I felt like I was holding more than timber. I was holding history. Every nail, every plank was a reminder that this cabin was not just property. It was family. It was the kind of place you defend with everything you have, because losing it would feel like losing the man who raised you. So when Margaret marched in, clipboard swinging and voice booming about compliance violations, I tried to laugh it off at first. Rules about siding and dock permits meant nothing to me compared to the years of sweat and care poured into this place. But the way she said it, with that smug tilt of her chin like she had already decided I was guilty, made my stomach churn. I asked my neighbor Tom if I was overreacting. He just shook his head. Said she had been circling everyone lately, inventing rules no one had ever heard of. He warned me she had a way of making life miserable if you crossed her. His voice carried the kind of fear that sticks with you like a shadow. Margaret did not just mention rules. She brought up her son Jake every single time. Her words slipped out like a confession. "You know, Jake really appreciates lakefront properties, or young families need recreational access. Don't you think I tried to brush it off?" But her eyes told a different story. They lingered too long on the cabin walls, on the dock rails on the way. The morning light hit the water. It felt less like an inspection and more like shopping. And every time she left, I wondered how long it would be before she tried to take what was not hers. Then Jake showed up. Bold, brazen, entitled. He walked my dock like it already belonged to him, running his hand along the railing, like he was testing its strength. His grin was the same as his mother's, rehearsed and hollow. He even pulled out his phone to measure the length of my dock, pretending it was admiration. But I could see the hunger in his eyes. He wanted what my grandfather had built, and he wanted it for free. One day I caught him sketching notes in a little book with the words, "Renovation ideas" scribbled on the cover. Renovations on my cabin. The nerve made my blood boil. I tried to stay calm, to believe maybe I was imagining things, but every instinct screamed they were. Plotting something, Margaret escalated from casual visits to official-looking letters. My dock under review. My property lines in question. My workshop noise violating rules that did not exist. The legal jargon was endless. Each letter, another attempt. To push me closer to surrender, I would stand on the dock some nights, staring at the lake, and wonder, am I being stubborn, or am I standing in the only place that matters? But the truth became undeniable the morning Margaret arrived with a surveyor and a folder thick with documents. She laid them out on my kitchen table with the confidence of a judge handing down a sentence. According to her papers, the cabin I had inherited was not mine at all. It was HOA common property. Her voice carried the false sympathy of someone who already believed she had won. She called it a boundary error from 30 years ago. My cabin, my dock, my workshop, all suddenly claimed as theirs. I remember stepping outside holding those papers, hands shaking as I ran my fingers along the dock rails my grandfather had hammered into place. The indentations of his tools were still there, proof that what she was saying could never be true. And yet the official stamps, the signatures, the maps, they all painted a different story. A fraudulent story, but one powerful enough to strip me bare in front of the law. I hired a lawyer, and thank God I did. She saw through the fraud immediately. Margaret had been using her old real estate connections to file revised surveys. She had forged an entire paper trail designed to make it look like the cabin never belonged to us at all. But hearing the word fraud spoken out loud did not comfort me. It shook me. Because fraud meant years in court, thousands of dollars. In fees, sleepless nights, wondering if truth would ever be enough. Then came the eviction notice. 30 days to clear out of my own cabin. My hands trembled as I held it in my workshop, the same place where my grandfather's tools still hung on the wall. I traced the handle of his old chisel, the one he had taught me to sharpen until it could split a board with ease. I thought of how he used patience and skill to carve beauty from raw timber, while someone else was trying to carve my family legacy out from under me. That night I swore I would not let them erase what generations had built. I was not just fighting for a cabin, I was fighting for memory, for pride, for the truth carved into wood grain and sunlight reflecting off water. Margaret thought she could erase all of that with paperwork. But she had no idea what kind of storm was about to hit her. Would you have walked away, or would you have fought for what was yours? Tell me what you would have done if someone handed your family legacy to their spoiled child. What would you do if you came home one morning and found a lock on your own front door? A lock you did not put there. That was the moment I realized this was no longer just a fight about paperwork or letters. It was war. Margaret had changed every lock on the cabin, bolted the windows, and nailed no trespassing signs to the oak tree my grandfather planted decades ago. Standing there staring at that brass lock so shiny and new against the weathered wood, I felt like I was in some kind of nightmare. I turned the key in my pocket anyway, knowing it would not fit, but praying somehow I was wrong. It didn't turn. Then I walked around to the back and saw him, Jake, already inside, already moving my life around like it was his. His truck was parked, outside half-unloaded boxes spilling onto the grass. The sight of my handmade rocking chair sitting in the corner while strangers carried in his junk nearly dropped me to my knees. But what nearly broke me was catching sight of him through the kitchen window, sipping coffee from the mug I made with my grandfather when I was 14. The initials JMM burned into the handle, stared back at me from Jake's careless grip. He was drinking from my childhood memory as if it belonged to him. Moved into my life like he had been waiting for it all along. His social media lit up with pictures of him grinning on my dock, bragging about his new lakefront lifestyle, grateful for family who looks out for family. He wrote the arrogance made my stomach turn. Every post, every caption was another knife twist. Neighbors began to whisper, asking if I had sold the place because how else could Jake be living there? And each whisper felt like shame wrapping itself tighter around my chest. Had not just lost my property, I had lost my dignity. Then came the party. Loud music, flashing lights, boats tied to my dock. People I had never seen before filling the cabin with laughter and shouting like it was their playground. The sound carried across the water and reached me in my own home a quarter-mile away. Nails on a chalkboard. That night I drove over heart-pounding, hands tight on the wheel. I did not know if I was about to scream, fight, or collapse, but when I stepped onto the property, I saw something that froze me. Jake had turned my workshop into a bar, tools, shoved aside beer bottles littering the workbench, where my grandfather once taught me to carve. The smell of alcohol, mixed with sawdust, made me sick. I stood there in the shadows watching these strangers pour drinks on the very table my grandfather built by hand. And in that moment, the humiliation transformed into something harder, something sharper. A plan began to form in my mind. A plan for a different kind of boundary. A line Margaret and Jake would never cross again. I walked back to my truck, heart hammering like a drum, pulled out an old surveyor's stake and drove it into the earth at the edge of Margaret's yard. My grandfather had taught me how to set those stakes when I was young. This one felt heavier, like it carried more than just wood. It carried justice. You want lines, I whispered to myself. I will show you lines. The next morning I hired my own surveyor. Not one of Margaret's friends. Not one of her old real estate buddies, but a man who had worked in our county for 15 years and owed loyalty to no one but the truth. When he returned with the results, my jaw dropped. Margaret's beige fortress, her house, her garden, even her mailbox sat 15 feet over the legal boundary. She had been living on common HOA land for years without even realizing it. All that time she had been accusing others of violations, she herself was the violator. I remember laughing when the surveyor showed me the documents, Not a laugh of joy, more like disbelief. Pure irony. The universe had handed me a weapon sharper than any chisel or saw, and I knew exactly how to use it. I filed the papers with the county and laid out my plan. One board, one post at a time, I began to build the most satisfying project of my life. A fence. A line of cedar and nails that would cut through Margaret's front yard, like truth cutting through lies. Neighbors gathered to watch as I sank the first posts into the earth. Margaret burst out of her house in her bathrobe, shrieking that I could not build a fence through her yard. I kept measuring, calm, steady, chisel in hand. My voice carried across the lawn like thunder. According to your own rules, Margaret, this is HOA property. Now I am just exercising my rights. For the first time since this war began, I saw real fear flash in her eyes. Would you have stopped? Would you have let her win? Or would you have kept hammering that fence into the ground until the truth stood tall and undeniable? Everyone stopped to watch the fence rise, post by post, board by board. It was more than wood and nails. It was a declaration. Each cedar plank carried weight heavier than steel because it stood for every sleepless night, every threat, every lie Margaret had used to try to erase my family's legacy. By the third post, I paused, carved words into the wood with my grandfather's chisel. We keep ours ours. The grain split clean under the blade, and for the first time in months, I felt peace. Margaret's rage spilled out like fire. She shouted that I was destroying her yard, neighbors' property values, community standards. But this time no one stepped forward to defend her. Curtains shifted across the street. Heads peeked out from porches. People watched and listened, but stayed silent. Her empire of fear cracked right there in the daylight. Her power had always been built on intimidation, but the moment I started raising that fence, she stood alone. Jake tried his own approach, cocky grin replaced by a nervous smirk. He came over while I was driving, post sweat pouring down my face, hands steady with the hammer. Look, man, maybe we can work something out. He muttered, like this was a parking dispute, not grand theft. He even suggested we share the cabin. As if the legacy my grandfather built was a timeshare, I did not even look at him. Just told him if he wanted to resolve anything, he could start by moving out. He left pale-faced silence trailing behind him. Day by day, the fence grew taller, and Margaret's panic grew louder. The line cut straight through her prized garden right up to her front steps, blocking her walkway. She had to use a side entrance just to leave her house. Every strike of my hammer echoed across the neighborhood, and with each strike, her lies lost power. And then came the hand-carved sign. I mounted it proudly at the center. Boundaries matter. Survey completed. The date etched bold like a verdict carved in stone. The effect spread faster than I ever expected. Neighbors began stopping by asking questions about their own properties. An elderly couple told me about the gazebo Margaret had forced them to tear down years ago. Turns out their survey proved it was always on their land. Another neighbor discovered she had inflated her own square footage while suppressing theirs to rig property values. Margaret's schemes stretched farther than anyone imagined. What started as my fence turned into an investigation, a spark igniting dry grass. The neighborhood began to wake up. I saw it in their eyes, the same mixture of anger and relief I had carried for months. They realized they were not alone, that Margaret had been manipulating all of us, hiding behind her title, using power like a weapon one by one. They came forward with their stories. Their shame turned to fire, their silence to outrage. The rebellion was not planned, but it grew like a storm impossible to stop. The night before the HOA meeting, Margaret paced her yard screaming into her phone. Curtains pulled tight around her windows. For the first time, her voice cracked with desperation. She knew what was coming. The boardroom, the place where she had ruled like a queen, turned into her courtroom. Neighbors demanded her resignation. Some even threatened county investigation. Her closest ally slipped out the side door without a word. She looked around for support and found none. The fence had not just cut through her yard, it had cut through her armor. It showed the whole community, the truth she had buried for years. And suddenly the woman who once ruled with threats stood cornered, isolated, exposed. Would you have stopped with the fence, Or would you have pressed forward to pull every single mask from her face until the whole world saw what she really was? Have you ever watched someone who thought they were untouchable suddenly realize the walls were closing in? That was Margaret, the night the county investigators showed up at her door. She tried to smile the same way she always had, but this time, it cracked around the edges. The clipboard she once wielded like a sword trembled in her hands as officials flipped through her files, uncovering years of lies. Every fraudulent survey, every fake adjustment, every boundary shift laid bare. The same neighbors she had bullied for years stood behind the investigators watching in silence, but their silence was no longer fear. It was judgment. The fence had started it, but the investigation finished it. They found everything. 10 years of manipulation, forged surveys, stolen land, inflated assessments. It was not just my cabin she had stolen. It was dozens of properties, hundreds of thousands of dollars, siphoned away while she lectured us about community standards. The truth spread like fire through dry brush. Neighbors who once avoided conflict came forward, now empowered by proof. Her empire crumbled piece by piece. Jake's downfall was even uglier. The kid who strutted around my cabin posting selfies and bragging about his new lakefront lifestyle suddenly found those same posts used as evidence. Every caption, every grin, every comment about deserving it all was proof he knew exactly what he was part of. Prosecutors called it arrogance. I called it karma. Watching his face in court when they played his own videos was like watching a mask fall off. He went from proud owner to exposed accomplice in seconds. When the eviction order came through, I drove back to the cabin, heart pounding with a mix of fear and hope. Would my tools still be there? Would my grandfather's rocking chair still stand by the window? I opened the door and breathed in the familiar scent of cedar and lake air. Everything was there untouched, as if the cabin itself had waited for me to come home. I ran my hand across the workbench, traced the initials carved into the mug handle, JMM. My grandfather's mark still intact. The relief was so sharp it felt like pain. The county ordered Margaret to pay restitution. She sold her house to cover damages. Banned from serving on any HOA again. Sentenced to jail for fraud and theft. Jake forced to work off his own restitution stocking shelves at a grocery store. The sight of him in that uniform, head down, no phone in his hand, no doc behind him, was almost more satisfying than getting the cabin back. He had lived in my life for a handful of weeks and lost everything in return. But the real victory was not just legal or financial. It was standing on the dock at sunrise, coffee in hand, watching the light ripple across the water, knowing the legacy had survived. They tried to erase my family with lies, but wood and water do not lie. My grandfather's hands lived in every plank of that cabin, in every grain of cedar and oak. And no fraud, no forged paper, no spoiled son could ever erase that. Neighbors rebuilt what Margaret had torn down. The elderly couple raised their gazebo again. Children played in yards once ruled by her threats. The new board posted real surveys for everyone to see, transparency. Replacing tyranny. And right there at the edge of the street, my fence stood proud and tall. Carved words staring back at anyone who passed. Boundaries matter. That fence became more than just wood. It became a story, a warning, a promise people brought their kids to see. It told them about what happens when someone tries to steal what does not belong to them. It reminded everyone that legacies are worth fighting for, that bullies do not always win, that truth sometimes stands taller than lies. Sometimes, the best justice is not a courtroom or a jail sentence. Sometimes it is the sight of a fallen tyrant forced to walk through the very gate she once claimed was hers. Forced to see the sign carved in cedar that said in no uncertain terms, "You lost wood. You have fought that hard. Would you have risked everything for memory and legacy, or would you have walked away and let the lies win?" Everyone thought the story was over when Margaret was hauled off in handcuffs, but the truth was her shadow still hung heavy over the neighborhood. For weeks after the sentencing, people whispered her name like it carried a curse. Some wondered if she might appeal, try to claw her way back. Others feared someone just like her would take her place. But as I stood by the fence every morning watching neighbors walk by, I realized something had shifted permanently. The silence that once carried fear now carried respect. Instead of looking away, people stopped, waved, asked about the cabin, even thanked me for standing up when no one else had. The cabin itself felt different too, like it had exhaled after holding its breath all those months. I stepped back inside, ran my hand across the workbench, and felt the weight of my grandfather's presence again. The tools hung in perfect order, the chisel sharp, the saw steady. It was as if time had paused the moment I was forced out and waited for me to return. That first night back, I brewed coffee in the old kettle, sat in the rocking chair by the window, and stared at the lake. The water was calm, the air crisp, and for the first time in forever, I felt peace. But peace was not all I felt. Rage still flickered inside me, not just for myself, but for everyone Margaret had hurt. I thought of the couple forced to tear down their gazebo, of the neighbors whose taxes she had manipulated, of every person who had swallowed her threats just to avoid being crushed by her power. And I knew my fight had lit something in them too. They were no longer hiding. They were ready to take their community back. The new HOA board moved fast. They voted in transparency rules, posted every survey publicly, and invited every homeowner to bring forward concerns without fear. People who had once whispered now spoke loudly and proudly. The elderly couple rebuilt their gazebo with neighbors helping hammer nails and raise beams. One man even joked that Margaret's downfall was the best community project they had ever had. I laughed with him, but deep down, I felt something else. A strange pride, not just in what I had won, but in what we had all reclaimed. Jake's humiliation did not end with the courtroom. Every time I walked into the local store and saw him stocking shelves, head low, eyes avoiding mine, I remembered the day he drank coffee from my grandfather's mug. That image had nearly broken me, but this one rebuilt me. Watching him live a life he never wanted, working for wages instead of stealing for comfort, was justice in its own right. I never spoke to him, but sometimes I wondered what he thought when he looked at me. Did he feel shame? Regret? Or was he still blaming everyone but himself? The fence remained the loudest voice of all. Its cedar boards stood firm against the wind, rain, and snow. Neighbors came by often to take pictures. Some parents even brought their kids to explain why it mattered. Boundaries matter, they would say, pointing to the carved sign. And I realized the fence had become more than mine. It belonged to the whole neighborhood. A lesson, a reminder, a line drawn not just in wood, but in memory. One evening, as the sun set, casting golden light across the boards, I thought of my grandfather again. I could almost hear his voice telling me the grain will show you which way to go. I had followed that grain not in wood this time, but in life. It had led me through fraud, shame, anger, and despair, and it had brought me back to truth, back to legacy, back to the cabin that meant everything. Justice does not always arrive quickly. Sometimes it takes months of pain. Sometimes it takes years of silence. But when it comes, it stands taller than lies, stronger than fear. And when I leaned against the fence that evening, feeling its strength beneath my hands, I knew Margaret's story was finished. But mine. My family's story had only just begun. Would you have built that fence? Would you have carried the weight of an entire neighborhood on your shoulders? Or would you have stepped back and hoped someone else would fight? Everyone in town thought Margaret's downfall was the end, but what none of us expected was the ripple it left behind. The fence was no longer just wood, hammered into the soil. It had become a symbol people drove from other neighborhoods to see. Cameras flashed, children posed beside the carved sign, "Boundaries Matter." The story of one cabin, one fence turned into something larger than me, larger than Margaret. It was the proof that one person could stand up to a bully and win neighbors. Began uncovering more of her schemes. Old letters, fake surveys, misplaced documents. She had stolen years of peace from this community, not just my cabin, and the county investigators made sure every last piece of her fraud was exposed. More charges. More fines, more restitution. She had built her life on lies, and every board of that fence reminded everyone what the truth looked like. I thought the pride of getting my cabin back would fade over time, but it grew stronger every day, every morning. I brewed coffee in the same mug my grandfather and I carved when I was 14. I sat on the dock and let the light spill over the water. The silence no longer carried fear. It carried victory. It carried gratitude. I had fought not only for myself, but for every neighbor too afraid to raise their voice. and now their voices filled the air louder than Margaret ever had. Jake, meanwhile, had become a ghost of the boy who once strutted around calling my cabin his. He avoided eye contact at the store, kept his head down, shoulders slumped. He was just another worker now, no doc, no mug, no legacy. His downfall felt different than Margaret's. Hers was sharp like a gavel slamming. His was slow like sand slipping through fingers. Every time I saw him, stocking shelves, I felt the sting of memory, but also the quiet justice that comes when someone finally learns life is not free. The new HOA board built something Margaret never had: trust. They turned part of her seized yard into a small community park right beside my fence, a place where families could gather, where laughter replaced fear. Children played tag where she once shouted orders. Elderly couples sat on benches looking out at the water with peace in their eyes. And every time they passed through the fence gate to the park, they brushed against the carved words, "Boundaries matter." A lesson carried forward. One night, while staining the boards of the fence to protect them from the coming winter, I caught myself whispering to my grandfather, "I hope you're proud," I said out loud. And in the creak of the dock, the whisper of the water, I felt like he answered. The cabin stood firm, the fence even firmer, and my hands rough with work were the same hands he once guided over a cedar board. The grain had led me here. The most surprising part was the messages online. Strangers who had heard about the fence sent notes telling me it gave them courage to stand up to their own battles. A woman wrote that she finally challenged her landlord after years of silence. A man said he had filed a complaint against his HOA for the first time after seeing the photos of my fence. People I would never meet were drawing their own lines because they had seen mine. Sometimes I walk the length of that fence at night when the stars shine on the lake. Each post is like a heartbeat, steady, unbroken. Every strike of the hammer still echoes in my mind, reminding me what it cost and what it gave back. Margaret thought she could erase a legacy with ink and lies. She was wrong. A legacy carved in wood, carved in love, carved in bloodlines cannot be erased. Would you have built it too? Would you have stood in the middle of the storm with everyone watching, not knowing if you would win? Or would you have stepped back, hoping someone else would carry the weight? The morning I saw Margaret forced to use the gate in my fence to reach her own mailbox was the morning I finally understood what victory looked like. She had once strutted through the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, barking orders like a queen in her castle. Now she shuffled across her yard, head low, eyes darting past the carved sign, "Boundaries matter." The very wood she had tried to control now controlled her. Every step she took past that sign was another reminder of the empire she lost. Cabin felt more alive than ever. The rocking chair by the window creaked in rhythm with the waves. The workshop hummed again with the sound of chisels and saws. The smell of cedar filled the air. I was no longer a man hiding from letters and threats. I was the keeper of a legacy stronger than lies. And every neighbor who stopped by to see the cabin again treated it not just as my home, but as proof that truth still had a place in this world. The county report spread across the news. Margaret exposed as a fraud not just here, but in other neighborhoods too. Years of schemes unraveled. Her name became a warning whispered like a storm cloud, and the restitution she was forced to pay rebuilt more than bank accounts. It rebuilt trust in a community that had lived too long in fear. Neighbors held barbecues where she once held meetings. Children laughed louder than she ever shouted. The neighborhood healed. Jake's story turned into the bitter lesson everyone whispered about: the boy who once boasted about his lakefront life, now pushing carts at the grocery store. His hands, once wrapped around my grandfather's mug, now blistered from work. His silence heavier than any insult, and every time our eyes met, he looked away. Shame followed him like a shadow. His arrogance had built nothing but his fall. But what stayed with me most was the quiet mornings I spent at the dock. Coffee in my hand, sunrise painting gold across the water. I would run my hand across the wood rails, feel the dents my grandfather left, the same ones I once traced as a boy, and I would think about how close I came to losing it all. One forged paper, one fraudulent survey could have stolen 30 years of history. And yet it stood. The cabin survived. The dock stood. The fence rose like a monument, The new HOA board put a community bulletin board right beside my fence. They posted maps, surveys, records, all in plain view. Neighbors could see every line, every boundary, nothing hidden anymore. That board became another kind of fence, transparent, solid, a wall against lies. And together with mine, it told a story loud enough for generations to hear. Sometimes I wonder if Margaret understood in those final weeks before jail how completely she had destroyed herself. Did she realize the same fence that blocked her walkway would also block her legacy? Did she grasp that her son would remember her, not as a protector, but as the reason he lost everything? Every time I carve wood in the workshop, I think of the lesson my grandfather gave me. The grain shows you which way to go. That grain led me through darkness, through humiliation, through rage. And it led me here to victory, carved in cedar, justice, etched into earth. Would you have trusted the grain? Would you have kept fighting when every document said you had already lost? Or would you have let the fraud stand and walked away from the legacy you were meant to protect? The night the sentence was handed down, I walked the length of my dock under a sky filled with stars. The lake was quiet, the air still, and for the first time in years, my chest did not feel heavy. Margaret was gone, stripped of her power, her house. Sold her title, erased, her son left, humiliated, forced into the grind of real work, while my cabin stood tall, untouched, and more alive than ever. I leaned against the railing, ran my hand across the wood, and whispered to my grandfather, "We did it." The fence glowed faintly in the moonlight, each board solid, each post steady. The hand-carved sign, "Boundaries Matter," caught the light, and I thought about how many people had stopped to touch those words. Neighbors, children, strangers from other towns. People saw more than a fence. They saw proof that truth can outlast lies, that legacy can outlast theft, that a single man can hold back an entire storm with nothing but courage, wood and iron nails. Life in the neighborhood changed completely. A Nav's elderly couple rebuilt their gazebo exactly where it had once stood, this time with laughter and help from neighbors instead of shame and silence. The new board opened every meeting with surveys laid out on the table, visible to all. No secrets, no hidden lines, no forged papers. The community that once trembled under Margaret now thrived without her. Her name became nothing more than a warning told in hushed tones of what greed can cost. I sat in the workshop again, tools in hand, sawdust in. The air carving wood felt different now. Every cut was a reminder of what I had almost lost. Every finished piece, a victory reclaimed. I carved another sign with my grandfather's chisel, not for the fence but for the cabin itself. Legacy defended. I hung it above the door so that anyone who entered would know this place was more than wood and nails. It was family. Neighbors began gathering at the fence for barbecues. Kids played tag, weaving around the posts. The space Margaret once guarded, like a fortress, became a park alive with voices, laughter, and music. The sound carried across the lake, sweet and strong, replacing the bitter echoes of her tyranny. And every time a child pointed at the carved words on the fence and asked what it meant, a parent explained, "Sometimes people will try to take what is not theirs, and sometimes you have to fight to hold on." Jake disappeared from the neighborhood altogether. Rumor said he moved in with relatives far away, embarrassed by the stain on his name. But his downfall was already carved into memory. He had become a story parents told their kids about arrogance and greed, about what happens when you try to steal a life you never earned. Margaret thought she was securing a legacy for her son. Instead, she handed him nothing but shame. 6 months later, I stood on the dock again, coffee mug in hand, the same one carved with my grandfather's initials, JMM. The sun rose, painting the lake in gold. The fence stretched strong across the yard, the cabin behind me, safe, unshaken. The air was calm, my heart steady, and I knew this fight had been worth every sleepless night, every lawyer bill, every moment of doubt. Some things cannot be sold. Some things cannot be stolen. They must be defended. Grain had shown me the way. My grandfather's voice had guided me through every choice, every strike of the hammer. And now the cabin stood as proof. Justice does not always roar. Sometimes it stands quiet, as cedar, firm as oak, steady as a fence on the edge of a lake. If it were your family's legacy, Would you have fought? Would you have carved those words into wood? Would you have drawn a line so bold no one could ever cross it again?